Hello and welcome to the lecture on selectors. So let's understand how to create selectors. Okay, these are nothing but the rules that you write on your web page. So let's create a folder. We'll try to understand different types of selectors that you can create. So I'm gonna create each selector one file. Okay, so that when you want to refer it back, you understand how many types of selectors that we have. Okay, so I'm gonna name it from 1 to 12 selectors that we're going to see here. All right, so let's write the selectors first. So I'm going to open my brackets here. All right, so let's open our file selector.html. So I'm going to copy paste the basic boilerplate here. All right, so let's start writing a selector. So how do you write a selector? Okay, so let me show you the syntax first, then we're going to start writing the selectors, all different types of selectors. So the name of the selector is like this. We have seen this previously, how to write CSS. So the name of the selector is basically nothing but the name, okay, where this rule should be applied. And inside the selector you have something called as property colon whatever the value of it, and this is called as declaration. Okay, and then you can have multiple properties. If there's one property 1 and value 1, okay, you end with a semicolon and then you call this as a declaration. This is the selector and this is the declaration. So whenever I'm gonna refer to a declaration or property, I'm gonna say this is how the declaration looks like. And when we talk about selectors, you can say the first selector or h1 selector is nothing but the rules that you apply onto tags, or you can write your custom selectors and then you apply them on the HTML tags. So this is nothing but how you basically write a selector and what are the terminologies that we use and what is called as selector and what is called as declaration, and inside selector what is a property and what is a value. All right, so let's start writing the selector. So we're going to convert this into CSS comments, right? So let's write our first selector. So I'm applying the rule on the h1 tag, okay, because we have an h1 tag here, and I'm saying color is red. Okay, this is h1 is called as selector, the color is called as property, and the value is red. Right, similarly for p tag we will apply the property of font weight as bold. Okay, let's open this file. You can do the live preview as well, and you can see the heading is red and paragraph is bold. The most important thing you have to learn is how to create a selector and what is the naming convention of it. This is called a selector, this is called as property, this is called as a value, this is called as a declaration. The declaration is complete property colon value is a declaration. You can write multiple declaration by ending each declaration with a semicolon. All right, so we have seen this. So next we will continue looking at other selectors as well. So let's create another selector. So let's create universal selector as our second selector. So I'm calling it universal. All right, let's open this. So let's open our universal.html and we're going to copy paste the same boilerplate code on the universal. All right, so the universal selector basically have something called as asterisk. Okay, this is asterisk means it's universal, so whatever rule that you apply it here will be applicable to all the tags. So if you want to apply a rule to all the tags in the HTML, you basically mention that selector as asterisk. So when you mention anything with asterisk, and I'm going to say the color is red, so I'm going to have a border to it. Let's add a border of red. So for that the property is border style is solid and border color is red. Right, the interesting thing about universal selector is all the tags get a border now. Okay, then you'll understand how many tags are there and what are the properties of it. So let's look at the preview of this, and you will see boxes all around. Okay, the boxes are coming up from body tag, even the body tag, h1 tag, p tag, right? So everybody is having a border now. So you see the red border is applied for all the tags, right? That's basically coming up from the universal selector. So if you have a rule that you want to apply for all the tags in the HTML page, that's basically you will use universal selector. So that's about universal selector. Let's look at another selector called as type selector. Type selector is basically you're mentioning the HTML tags. Okay, so let's create that type selector. I'm gonna copy paste this universal selector. Right, let's open this up. I'm gonna copy paste all the type selector into this. All right, so let's understand how to define a type selector. So type selector is nothing but you mention the selector, you have a property and a value, and in the type selector you mention what type of HTML tag it is. Okay, you are really mentioning the type of the HTML tags in the type selector. You can mention the p tag here, and now you can say h1 has a border of red and p tag is border of green, right? So you can see the borders are coming up for heading tag and also for the paragraph tag. You can also mention, let's say you have one rule that you want to apply for multiple tags. So you can say h1 comma p. Okay, and I want to apply this rule for h1 and also for the p tag, and I want to say font style is italics, right? So you can see there's one rule that has been applied to both of the tags. Okay, that's basically the type selector. In type selector you can mention multiple tags using the comma. You can just take comma comma comma, and all the tags that has been having mentioned here in the type selector, this rule will be applied onto them. Okay, type selector basically you will mention the HTML tags here. All right, so let's put this in the type selectors. I will call it as a type selector. All right, so this is how it will look like. The h1 is having a red border, p1 is having a green border, and then we have applied italics for both h1 and p. Well, that's about the type selector. Okay, so next let's look at class selector. So I'm gonna create, copy paste the same file. So I'm gonna say class. Okay, class selectors are custom selectors. Okay, it's custom because you predefine whatever you want as a name. I'll call this as a class selector. Okay, and how do you define a class selector? You put it as a dot. So when you mention anything as a dot, it becomes a class selector, means it is not an HTML tag, but you can assign this selector to any HTML tags. We'll look at how we're gonna do it. And remember, anything that you mention dot in the front, it becomes the class selector. Okay, this is a type selector, so we'll convert it into a class selector. We'll say red border. Okay, and this one is a green border. Okay, and this one we will say it's a text italics. Okay, you remember, you see how I'm doing it? I'm putting a dot here and I'm mentioning this as a class selector, which is a custom name. So anything I can put name here. Even when I put h1, it doesn't really apply to the h1. Okay, that's basically you are mentioning as a custom name. So you can use this name to apply to any HTML tags. Okay, now that we have defined our CSS, let's apply this class to the HTML tags. Okay, you can see the HTMLs are plain simple, no CSS has been applied it here. So let's apply this class to the tags. Okay, how to apply class to an HTML tag? You can say class. Okay, that's a property of HTML tag. Then now you can say it is green border. Okay, I can see the green border has appeared. Similarly for p tag, you can say class. Okay, you can say red border. Okay, and you can see the red border here. You can also see that I'm not typing the dot. Okay, I'm not saying dot green here. Okay, this dot is just to indicate this is a class. If you remove this, it becomes a type selector, so it doesn't understand whether it's an HTML tag or not. So to mention to the browser that this is basically a class selector, you mention with a dot. Okay, now this becomes a class and you can apply it to any HTML tag via the class property. You can even loop the class selectors, means you want to have a green border plus you want to have another property called text italics. Okay, you can see that text has become italics, and you just have to attach with the space. There's no comma here. You add multiple type selectors via the space, and you want to have the same text italics for paragraph. You can just mention like this and it becomes italics here. Well, class selectors are basically one of the important selectors that you will work a lot in CSS, and you will find yourself most of the time creating the class selectors and applying onto the HTML. So make sure you work through this class selector and understand how it works. There's one more type that you can have in class selector is assigning the class selectors to a specific HTML tag. Let's say you want to assign a green border only to h1 tag, right? You want to do that, and what you want to do is you want to apply this green border, okay, only for h1 tag. So how you're going to do it? You mention the type selector, that is nothing but the HTML tag dot the class selector. Well, this rule is saying that the green border class selector is applied only for h1 tag. So if you apply in green border to p tag or any other tag, it will not work. So you can see here the width is increased to 15 px. Let's assign this green border to the p tag and then see whether the border width will be increased or not. And here we have mentioned the rule as make sure this green border only works for h1 tag. That's what you're saying it here. And if you remove the red border and apply green border, you can see the border is green but the width is not been applied because this condition only applies for h1 tag. Okay, so that's how you work with class selectors. We're going to look at other selectors as well, and then we'll continue to use class selectors as we go forward. Okay, so that's all about the class selector, and let's look at other selectors now. Let's look at the ID selector. So let's save our file and we'll use the same class and we'll convert into an ID selector. Okay, we'll call it as ID. And how do you define an ID selector? Instead of dot, you mention hash. Okay, so we're going to convert all these things into ID selectors. So we can create same name, one with class and one with even ID selector. Okay, similarly for the green border, we'll create one more ID selector. Even for h1 italics. For this one, we can create the similar names. And also for h1 dot green border, how you think we're gonna write the ID selector? So instead of dot, you mention hash. That's all you have to do. All right, so let's start applying the rule. Okay, there is a difference between ID and the class because you see you have same rules, one with ID and one with class. So you have to understand what is the difference between ID and the class. So we're going to discuss some of the differences here, and we'll also understand how to apply ID. Okay, so for ID you have a property called ID and you just have to mention the property name. So I'll say green border and I'm gonna say ID selector custom name, right? And similarly you can mention class. Okay, same green border, you can say ID selector, this is nothing but the class selector custom name, right? You just have to say class, right? So you have the green borders, it's just selected, that's why the color changes, but it's both basically the green borders, right? Now what is the difference? You cannot have multiple rules for ID selector. Let's say you want to do text italics, okay, and you save it, it's not applied it here. Actually the rule itself is gone, right? But if you do same thing for class selector, that's possible. So remember this difference. for ID selector, you have to have one selector. You cannot have multiple selectors with the spaces. Okay, once you do that, means the actual rule will be gone. It consider everything as one selector, right? For class, you can loop the selectors with the spaces. Okay, that's one of the differences. And ID should only be one per element. You cannot have two per element. Okay, so let's quickly write those as a comment so you understand the difference between ID selectors and class selectors. ID should be only one per element. That's what we saw previously. Okay, and IDs are unique. You cannot duplicate it. You're gonna see that. Then each element can only have one ID. You cannot have multiple IDs. And each page at the page level can have only element with that ID. Okay, you cannot even duplicate the ID at the page level. Okay, I'm going to show you that what that example means. All right, so what is this rule that says IDs are unique? Okay, you should not create something like this. Okay, you should not repeat IDs inside the same element. You can repeat the ID in the different elements, but don't try to make a habit of writing IDs of the same elements. All right, it won't take much impact, but the way it is, ID is being used. ID is basically an identifier for your element, and if you go to JavaScript, ID is basically will be a reference point of this element in the DOM. So typically when we write ID, we tend to have unique names. We don't want to duplicate names. You'll have challenges when you want to mention IDs for your element. That is nothing but the reference names of your element. And if you duplicate it, then it's hard to find unique elements in the HTML pages. So it's always recommended the IDs should be unique. So most of the time you will find yourself to work with classes, because classes, once you mention, then you can have multiple selectors using the classes. The other benefits which we're going to discuss, and also ID is nothing but a reference of an element, so typically you use it for referring that element. Okay, and make sure you don't duplicate IDs for each of the elements. Okay, so let's look some of the differences between ID and CSS. Let's get a new file and find some differences there. So let's create one more file. We'll copy the ID file, say 6th, and we'll try to work with class and ID together. Okay, let's open this file. All right, so let's have a green border. Let's create a green border of class, right? And then we're gonna have a red border as well. So I'm gonna have a red border of ID, green border of this, then we're gonna have italics of a class. Okay, so I'm mix and matching the IDs and class selectors. So this is nothing but the ID selector, then I have two class selectors, one red border as ID selector, green border as class selector, and italics as the class selector. Right, now let's remove all these other conditions that we have. Okay, and let's remove all these things. Let's understand the difference between ID and a class. Okay, one thing we know, if you want to apply a class, right, you can have green border. You can also have ID and class together, but you need to know which one will get executed. So if I say red border, okay, so when I have class and ID assigned to one HTML tag, you can see the red border has been assigned. Okay, it's here, right? You can see the differences. The red border has been assigned. It doesn't match which preference you write it. Means if you write it like this, it doesn't really matter the sequence, but ID has more preference than class. Means if you have class and ID and you have a rule that is been applied in class and ID, the ID takes the preference. If the rule is same, then ID take the preference of applying that rule. Okay, that's one difference that you have to understand between ID and a class. You know, if you have a class, you can have multiple selectors, and if you have ID, it says red border, right? So you can see the italics is still applied. That's basically the green border has been replaced with the red border because there is a clash between the same rules, same properties. So it takes the higher preference of the property for ID, and then the text italics have no clash, so it's just applied the text italics. So it is taking all the rules, then it's doing some kind of comparison between ID and a class, and the ID rules applied first, then whatever is the leftover of all the rules that has been applied onto the HTML tags, right? So remember these two most important difference. ID has more preference than class, and if you have ID and a class, all the additional rules that you have will be applied onto the HTML tags. Okay, that's why you see text italics is been applied even though ID has more preference over the class, because ID doesn't talk about text italics. Okay, that's one of the classic differences between ID and a class. Let's look at attribute selectors. So I'm going to copy paste this. I'm going to make it 8. Call it attribute selector. I'm going to delete all the ones that we don't need it. So I'm going to delete all these things. Now delete all the tags. Right? And we'll call it as attribute selector. Okay, and how do you define an attribute selector? You have a selector. So inside the selector you can mention the class name, and you can mention inside the square brackets, and this is basically you're defining the attribute of an HTML. You're checking whether if this attribute is available inside the HTML tag, then apply this rule. Okay, I'll give you a class an example for this. I'll say if the p tag has class, means if you have defined a class attribute for any of the p tags, any value, but attribute is present, then apply this rule. Okay, then make color as red. Okay, and font weight as bold. Okay, and it's simple to understand. If you have a p tag, this is a paragraph. Okay, the rule will not be applied, but when you have a paragraph, we'll just make it and say class, it has an attribute of class, then the rule is applied. Okay, it's easy to see. The rule is only applied when you have an attribute as class. Doesn't care what value it is, but if you just have the attribute, then this rule will be applied. That's nothing but the attribute selector. You can even go a little complex than this. You can mention color, you can mention class. If the attribute is, say the attribute name is color blue. Okay, then the color is blue, and then you mention this. Right, now let's have an HR tag. Okay, if you just have the class, then the red will be applied, but if you have this color blue as the value, doesn't require to define it, but it's just taking that attribute. If the class has this value, then you see the blue is applied, which is nothing but this rule is applied. But if you don't have any value, means you have the class tag, but if you have like something else, then nothing but this rule is applied. Okay, so this attribute selector is really checking the attributes of an HTML tag. So one condition we said, right, if you have a class attribute, apply this rule. If the class attribute has this value, then apply this rule. That's nothing but this one. Alright, so let's look at some more selectors. So let's look at a child selector. Okay, let's open this up. Let's say this is child. Okay, child is really like a child, like a parent and a child. You want to apply, if this parent is available and this is the child, then apply onto the child elements. Okay, so for this you have selector, and then you can mention which child of it. Okay, using this greater than symbol, you're just mentioning, okay, this is a parent on the left hand side, right hand side is a child. Okay, so let's look at one example of it. How do you write a child selector? Let's say you have a paragraph, and inside a paragraph you have an anchor tag. I want to apply this rule for the anchor tag only when it is inside the paragraph tag. Alright, and I want to make it color red. Okay, let's look at an example of this. Okay, this is a paragraph of text. Okay, to the paragraph I want to have an anchor tag. And you can see the paragraph will be red in color, right? That's basically the child selector only when the anchor tag is inside the parent tag. So what happens if the anchor tag is outside? Okay, there's no impact, it's blue in color. Okay, dark blue in color. So the impact is only available when anchor tag is inside the p tag, means anchor tag is a child tag to the p tag. Okay, what happens if you have like this? Let's write another rule, and let's say div tag and a tag. Okay, and then we'll say color is green and font weight is bold. Okay, let's write some div tags. Okay, now you have a div tag and a p tag. Okay, you have two rules. One is a under p is red, and one is a under div tag, that is green. So let's see how this will behave when the anchor tag is inside the p tag. Okay, so you can have an anchor tag here, and you can say lorem ipsum. Okay, and you can say the red is been applied. The red is nothing but this is applied because this has more preference over this, and you can see the green when it is inside the div tag, right? So understand how the parent and the child works. This is the child for this parent, this is the child for this immediate parent. So that's why the red is applied and the green is applied for this rule. So that's nothing but the child selector, and it is defined with the greater than symbol. The left hand side is the parent, right hand side is the child. When they go in this sequence, then only apply this rule. That's what the child selector says. Let's look at the another selector called descendant selector. This is the 10th one. Okay, let's open that up. Okay, and we'll call it as descendant selector. Okay, the descendant selector have something called a space. Okay, space means this is somewhere in the hierarchy, but this is the parent, and there's somewhere in the hierarchy and it is the child. Okay, a very good example is body. Okay, so inside the body you have any anchor tag, please make it red in color. Okay, irrespective of the div tags and p tags. So you see the a tag is under p tag, a tag is outside, a tag is under div tag, a tag is under p tag. But this descendant selector says apply this rule whenever it is inside the body irrespective of the hierarchy. So if you see, all the link tags become red in color. That's basically this rule says descendant that there is no immediate relation between child and parent, but anywhere in the hierarchy, means if I am the parent and he is the child, irrespective of under any other parents, right? Apply this rule. So it's a global condition that you apply, right? Inside this body, if you have any anchor tag, all the anchor tags, so any anchor tag inside the body, this rule will be applied to it. And how you define the descendant selectors, you mention something called a space. Okay, and once you have space, means this becomes the parent, this becomes a child. Okay, and if you just say div tag, okay, you can see this is not applied because this is under the paragraph. Okay, this parent and the child could be anywhere. You see p, under p also a tag is there, so that's why the relationship still exists between parent and the child irrespective of the sequence. Alright, so that's how the descendant selectors work. Let's look at adjacent sibling selector. Let me type it. Adjacent sibling selector. Okay, let's open that file. Okay, the adjacent selector goes with a symbol called plus. Okay, if div plus a. Okay, let's look at where it has been applied. So no condition has been applied, there's no anchor tag become red. So this rule says the div and the a must be adjacent and sibling, right? What is adjacent and what is sibling? So let me give you an example. So if you see here, the anchor tag is inside p tag, and anchor tag div tag is having anchor tag, but this is not adjacent. You know what is adjacent means? Adjacent means, let me put that for you. Okay, if you're having some text here, okay, it has to be sibling as well. This is parent and a child, right? A is under div means a becomes child, div becomes parent. Then what is sibling means? Sibling means they are side by side, right? They are side by side, they are adjacent and side by side. That's why you see the rule has been applied now, color red. Okay, they are sibling and they are adjacent means if you have, let's say you have h1 tag here, right? Now div and a are not adjacent, they are siblings but they are not adjacent. Okay, adjacent means the rule has to be applied right after the div tag, then only this rule will be applied, and it is called as, here is applied, it's called as adjacent sibling selector, which is nothing but denoted with plus, which means they have to be at the same hierarchy, that is the same sibling, same hierarchy level, cannot be inside like parent and child, it should be under the same level, and then it should be immediate right after that tag, then only this rule is applied. Adjacent means one after the other, sibling means same level, and that's how the rule is applied when you mention it as a plus. The a tag has to be right after the div tag and it should be under the same sibling. All right, so let's look at another example. Look at another example which is called as general adjacent sibling selector. So it's called as general adjacent sibling selector. Let's open this up. It's same as adjacent sibling selector with some differences. Okay, and it is denoted by the tilde symbol. This is a symbol you can find beside the number 1 keyboard. This is a tilde, right? So now you say tilde, okay, and you can see this special case, this case, right? You can see the color red is been applied. You can see color red is applied even though they are not in the same adjacent. Okay, this is basically general, means it is at the same sibling but don't have to be right after the div, it could be after anywhere in the same sibling but not adjacent. Okay, so you can say this rule says same sibling but not adjacent. Okay, so if you look at even this example, you have an HR tag. Okay, you can see the rule is keep applying because the rule says same sibling. Okay, if you have a tag inside a div tag, that rule is not applied, but if it is sibling anywhere in the hierarchy, then this rule has been applied. That's nothing but general adjacent sibling selector denoted with tilde. Alright, so these are the 12 selector rules that we're going to use to write CSS. Make sure if you want to learn some important topics in CSS, you learn the selector section. Okay, selectors nothing but tell you how you write your rules. Once you understand how to write the rules, You can refer to the guides and all those references to understand what are the property and the value. Just apply property and the value, but you need to know where and how you need to apply it and how to play around with the CSS. If there is inside a page, if there's one corner of the page you want to apply one style to it, you need to know how do you transverse and reach to that particular section of the page. Okay, with this rule, selector rules, it will help you to identify that particular section in the page and apply that rule only onto that HTML tag. All right, so that's all about how to work with selector, and I'll see you in the next lecture.